Hello everybody and welcome to this very special video. I'm sure this is going to help you. Please give it a thumbs up. As you know, if you're studying the AQA GCSE English Literature qualification, it's a closed book exam. That means you do not take the texts with you that you've been studying. So you don't get to take, for example, your poetry anthology. Now, that's really tricky, isn't it? Because, for example, in the poetry question, you're going to be given one poem from the cluster you've been studying, and that will be printed in the paper, but you'll be asked to compare it to another poem from the cluster, and you will not be given that poem. So everybody is working on memorizing quotations, and as you probably know, I've made a quotation rap for the poetry, which takes 15 key quotations and puts them to music, and you can follow the link in the description to check that out. But not many people have realised that the exam paper itself will give you 10 quotations that you can work with. That's across both of the clusters. I think it's 4 for one cluster, 6 for the other. And what do I mean by that? Well, in the question paper, they list the name of every poem to remind you of the poems you can choose from. Well, did you know that 10 of those titles actually can be found within the poem itself? So the title is part of the poem, either a word or a line from the poem, and therefore the title is a quotation. It reminds you of the quotation that is within the poem. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to go through the 10 poems, the 10 quotations, and I'm going to talk to you about how you could use that quotation in your analysis, because it's all very well knowing, okay, Ozymandias is the title of the poem and the word Ozymandias does appear in the poem, so I can use that as a quote, but you need to know what to say about it, don't you? So this is really good news. I'm going to cover both clusters here, and it just gives you more quotations to work with. So in the Power and Conflict cluster, the poem Ozymandias, we do have the line, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings." Now, what can we link this to? So we can actually analyse. My point is, if you wanted to compare the named poem, the presented poem, to Ozymandias, you can actually quote the word Ozymandias because it is a quotation from the poem, from the line, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings," if that makes sense. What do you need to know about it? It's a great contextual detail, really. Ozymandias, aka Ramesses II, was an Egyptian pharaoh who ruled from 1279 to 1213 BC, believed to be the pharaoh who was in charge of Egypt during the biblical exodus of Moses. Now, crucially, he was a ruler who led many battles to protect and extend the borders of Egypt. And in this way, it's possible to draw a comparison with King George III. We know that Shelley wrote Ozymandias during the reign of King George III, and a lot can be said about this king who reigned for longer than any other before him, but the key points of this poem are that King George III was involved in a great number of military conflicts around the globe. Shelley hated the oppressive monarchical government and felt that a revolution was needed to overthrow it. So you can use the single word Ozymandias to link to the context and the theme of oppressive government control that is so important in the poem. By the way, everything that I mentioned in this video actually comes from the individual poem analysis, so make sure you check out the playlists where I go through all this in a lot more detail. My Last Duchess, yes, it's the title, but it's also part of the first line, "That's my last Duchess painted on the wall." This is a great quotation to analyse because My Last Duchess has a number of themes, but all of them revolve around one major theme, which is power. And domestic power is where we see the Duke assert his power over his former wife, linked into themes of gender roles and sexism. So the pronoun my, which we see in the title My Last Duchess and in the first line, "That's my last Duchess painted on the wall," the pronoun my is repeated throughout the poem, showing how possessive the Duke is. And it also highlights how he objectifies women. Now let me just make this clear once more before we whiz through the rest of the quotations. If the named poem was Ozymandias, and I wanted to compare it to My Last Duchess, well, I know that My Last Duchess is a quotation, and I also know that if I refer to the quotation My Last Duchess, I can also mention that the pronoun my is repeated throughout the poem, so I'm also referencing the wider poem, all from just looking at the list of titles of poems in the exam paper. Poppies, we also see a line, "Poppies had already been placed on individual war graves." And the word poppies links to Armistice Sunday, helps us to understand the context. Armistice Sunday began as a way of marking the end of the First World War in 1918, and it was set up so people could remember the hundreds and thousands of ordinary men who'd been killed in the First World War. Today the event is used to remember soldiers of all wars who've died since then. So the mention of poppies, just the word poppies, which is a direct quotation from the poem, will be able to link to context. There's also a lot of imagery in that poem which we can see in both domestic and military terms, and this is one example. If you remember, she pins the poppy on her son and it's described as spasms of paper red. So if you can remember the wider quotation of spasms of paper red, that's a word of injury, which describes a very domestic thing, pinning a poppy on your son's lapel, in a sort of word related to war and conflict and injury. Tissue, that tricky poem, is actually a word we see in the poem. It's interesting because tissue serves as a metaphor throughout the entire poem, but it's mentioned here near the end, trace a grand design with living tissue. So just through quoting the word tissue, you can talk about how the poem is a critique of human power, how it highlights the fragility of man's power and the true power of nature. And in this interpretation, paper is used to symbolize mankind, both being fragile and yet powerful at the same time. So we can see paper as a metaphor for power. And the final line reminds us of the title. So it's separated to emphasize its importance on the page. This line is separated and it brings together human skin and tissue paper. Like the title, the metaphor highlights how human power is fragile like tissue paper. Or you can look at it a different way and use the quotation of tissue to reference conflict. It's possible to interpret the poem as one which suggests that we cause our own conflict by giving things power which don't deserve it, money, government, religion, and if we treat things like tissue, if we realise they're fragile, we will be happier. So those are the quotations from the power and conflict cluster. From Love and Relationships, When We Two Parted, is the first bit of the poem, isn't it? When we two parted in silence and tears. Now, what I like here is the fact that this is an example of accentual verse, which means that each line contains the same amount of stressed syllables. No matter how many syllables they are in the lines of this poem, they all contain 2 stressed syllables. Now, this changes on a couple of occasions, and there's one occasion where it changes, which is pale grew thy cheek and cold. Now if you've watched the poetry rap, you'll know that line and you'll be able to analyse that line. So through memorising the one line, pale grew thy cheek and cold, from the rap, and then referencing what is already given to us in the contents page as the title, which is part of the poem, we can talk about accentual verse, we can talk about how the poet disrupts this to show how upset he is, etc, etc. The full explanation of that is in my explanation of the rap. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnet 29, I Think of Thee. Well, it's clear that a large amount of imagery from the poem is biblical, and the word thee was not commonly used in England at the time. It had been out of fashion for 200 years, but it was used in the arena of churches. So this deliberately religious language once again highlights how Barrett Browning's love is all-consuming, physical and spiritual. Also, the exclamation mark there shows the intensity of the love, which is what the whole poem is about. There's the line, I think of thee, my thoughts do twine and bud. In the poem Walking Away, by the end of the poem, where we have selfhood begins with a walking away, there's a sense that the speaker has learned to accept the lack of control he has in the relationship. And structurally, the poet reaches a conclusion at the end in the final 2 lines, how selfhood begins with a walking away and love is proved with a letting go. So these lines show how the father has at least partially learned to let go and accept the change which has taken place in the relationship. So you don't need to memorize the line, you can just remember that comes near the end. It's a structural feature to show closure in the relationship and in the debate going on in the father's mind. Eden Rock. Well, of course, this comes from the first line of the poem, they are waiting for me somewhere beyond Eden Rock. Now, much of the poem contains biblical imagery. Eden Rock is no different. We know Eden Rock isn't a real place, it's a fictional setting, so we can analyse the symbolism of the language. And Eden is the beautiful paradise garden in which God placed Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis. Clearly, we have the intertextual reference to the Bible to describe the perfection of the parent-child relationship. In Mother Any Distance by Simon Armitage, as you know, the poem is actually unnamed. Every poem in that collection, Book of Matches, is, but they give it the name of the first line. So Mother Any Distance greater than a single span. And this establishes how the poem is directed to the mother. We know already the poem loosely follows the sonnet form, so those things together establish how important the mother is to the son, even though he is growing apart from her in the relationship. Before You Were Mine by Carol Ann Duffy, well, that's from the line, before you were mine, your ma stands at the close. And of course, before you were mine establishes the possessive nature of love, the word mine. But it also reverses the roles of parent-child relationships, which is what this poem is all about, that it's actually the daughter who's possessive over the mother when we'd expect it to be the other way round. So what am I saying? Let me just recap. In the exam, you have to compare a given poem to one of the other poems in the cluster. So you're going to need to memorize quotations, but just the titles of the poem are actually quotations in the case of these 10 poems. And the titles of the poem will be presented to you in the question paper. So it's just another bit of extra evidence to add into your answer. Of course, you wouldn't use all of these because you're only going to compare with one poem. But let's say the named poem is Eden Rock and you want to compare it to Mother Any Distance. Well, you know straight away, well, there's one quotation for me, Mother Any Distance, because it's part of the poem. It's not just the title.